Malcolm Reed's face hit the cold tile floor as two officers forced his arms behind his back, steel cuffs snapping tight around his wrists. Phones were recording, gasps filled the terminal, but none of that mattered. To them, he was just a suspicious black man in a suit, until they read his ID. The fading sun spilled burnt orange light across the tarmac of Horizon Gate International Airport, tinting the sky in bands of pink and brass as planes taxied between terminals. Inside the terminal, the shift from day to evening was marked by flickering overhead fluorescents, casting a sterile white glow over the bustling crowd. Gate agents clicked away at keyboards. Loudspeakers echoed with flight updates. Rolling suitcases clacked against the tile floor in a tired rhythm. Somewhere near Gate B7, a child cried, and a nearby phone buzzed with yet another gate change notification. Malcolm Reed moved through the terminal like a current moving under calm water, deliberate, steady, contained. He was 46, tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the quiet gravity of someone who had long known responsibility and visibility were both weight and weapon. His skin was deep brown, his frame leaned beneath a sharply tailored navy blue suit, and his dark leather briefcase swung low in his left hand. He bore no lapel pin, no ID badge, no obvious indicators of rank or power. Just a traveler, on his way back to Washington, D.C., after 4 days of classified oversight meetings in Denver. What no one in that terminal knew was that Malcolm Reed was the director of the National Intelligence Compliance Office, an agency tasked with holding federal departments accountable for violations of ethics and misuse of authority. But tonight, he wasn't a title. He was a man trying to get home. 40 yards away, Officer Bradley Kemp stood by a steel column near a Hudson News outlet, arms crossed over his vest, face pinched with irritation. Kemp was 58, white, and carried the kind of tired hostility that came not from fatigue but from decades of disillusionment. His uniform looked lived in, sun-faded in spots, the stitching near his shoulder frayed. Next to him stood Officer Logan Trask, 29, freshly pressed and wide-eyed, still trying to prove he belonged in the uniform. Trask's gaze followed passengers with steadied interest. He was learning to read crowds, learning what to see and what to ignore. Kemp wasn't teaching him empathy, just instinct. The kind that reduced individuals to types. Kemp's tablet buzzed with a new alert. He tapped the screen without enthusiasm. The note read, "Suspicious individual near Gate B7. Black male, formal wear, walking alone. Appears tense. No specific threat." Kemp snorted. "Well, that's helpful," he muttered. He nudged Trask with his elbow and nodded toward the man approaching the shuttle platform. "Got ourselves a potential fit." Trask followed his gaze. Malcolm Reed was the only black man in the vicinity wearing a suit. His gait was steady, expression unreadable, posture upright. To Trask, he looked like a business traveler, maybe a lobbyist or diplomat. Nothing about him screamed suspicious. But Kemp didn't wait. He adjusted his belt, tugged at the hem of his vest, and began walking toward Malcolm like he already knew how the story would end. Trask followed a step behind, unsure. Malcolm sensed the shift before he heard the words. A pair of boots approaching faster than the surrounding shuffle. The subtle tension in the air, like a charge before a storm. Then came the voice, sharp, officious, and loud enough to be performative. "Sir, stop right there." Malcolm paused. Turned. His eyes calmly scanned the two officers approaching. He knew the look. Knew the script. He'd seen it play out more times than he could count, from the news, from his investigations, from his own past. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked, voice neutral, with the low baritone of someone used to being listened to. "We received a report," Kemp said, stepping closer than necessary. "You match the description of a suspicious individual in this terminal. I need to see your identification." Malcolm's expression didn't change. He measured Kemp, red-faced, heavy-set, breath sour with coffee and stale authority. Then Trask, nervous, eyes darting between Malcolm and Kemp. "What exactly is this individual suspected of?" Malcolm asked. "Suspicious behavior," Kemp snapped. That's all you need to know right now. Show me your ID. At that moment, a woman named Reena Patel, a tech journalist from Raleigh with a nose for tension and a phone always within reach, slowed her stride near Gate B6. She'd seen enough interactions like this to know when something was off. Discreetly, she angled her camera and began filming, keeping the screen low, the lens aimed steadily. Malcolm sighed softly. Not exasperated, resigned. Very well, he said. He reached slowly into his breast pocket and pulled out his wallet, removing a Virginia driver's license and handing it to Kemp. Kemp glanced at it, uninterested in the details. Reed, huh? Malcolm Aaron Reed. What brings you to Horizon Gate dressed like you're heading to Langley? Malcolm didn't respond to the jab. His gaze remained steady. Trask stepped in, attempting a more casual tone. You here for business? Federal work? The question wasn't curiosity, it was bait. Malcolm folded his hands calmly in front of him. I've provided my identification. Unless you can articulate reasonable suspicion of a crime, I'd like to proceed to my connecting flight. Kemp's lip curled. Oh, you're one of those. Knows his rights. Probably went to some fancy law school. Thinks the rules don't apply. Trask shifted uncomfortably. Sir, Malcolm said evenly. I've complied with your request. I'm not under arrest. I am not being detained. Unless that changes, I will be on my way. You don't walk away when a cop's talking to you, Kemp growled. You think because you've got a nice suit and a fancy name, you can play games? Reena's recording continued. Malcolm took a single step, not toward the officers, just toward his gate. It was deliberate, not aggressive. But to Kemp, it was defiance. Resisting, Kemp barked. He's resisting. Trask, get him down. Trask froze. Sir, now. Kemp lunged. Malcolm reacted instinctively, not with violence, but with trained defense, stepping back, raising a hand. Don't touch me, he warned. You have no lawful cause, that was enough for Kemp. He tackled Malcolm hard. Trask grabbed an arm. Together they forced him to the ground, his head striking the tile floor. Passengers around them gasped. One woman shouted. Several phones lifted into the air. Malcolm's briefcase spilled open, documents scattering. A red file stamped with a federal seal lay face up, NICO, confidential oversight memo. But neither officer noticed. Kemp shouted for Trask to cuff him. You like quoting rights? Let's see how smart you sound in the back of a squad car. Trask's hands trembled as he locked the cuffs. The steel bit into Malcolm's wrists. Pain shot up his arm, but it was nothing compared to the slow burn of humiliation, of being reduced to nothing more than a profile. Around them, the terminal had gone nearly silent. Dozens of eyes watched. Reena zoomed in on Malcolm's face, calm, quiet, but undeniably betrayed. The man who had said nothing wrong now sat on a cold floor in cuffs. The man who upheld justice across federal agencies was being treated like a suspect because someone didn't like how he looked walking alone in a suit. And in that moment, no one, not even the officers, understood just how wrong they were. Not yet. But they would. The handcuffs dug into Malcolm Reed's wrists, cold and unyielding, biting into his skin with every breath he took. The tiled floor beneath him felt like stone, indifferent and hard. Around him, the once bustling terminal had gone eerily quiet. Travelers stood frozen, some with phones still raised, others whispering to companions with wide-eyed disbelief. The man they had just watched be thrown to the ground didn't yell. Didn't curse. He sat upright, his back straight despite the bruising force used to put him there, his breathing controlled, his gaze fixed forward with the steady focus of a man who'd endured worse, but never in public like this. The Navy suit that had once marked him as a professional now bore the scuffs and wrinkles of assault. And a few feet away, partially crumpled on the floor, lay the red-stamped folder that had tumbled from his briefcase. The NICO seal on it caught the light, bold, official, unmistakable. Officer Logan Trask hovered nearby, crouched slightly, his fingers twitching. His pulse thundered in his ears. The adrenaline hadn't worn off yet, but something colder had begun to settle behind his ribs, dread. With trembling hands, he reached for the ID still clutched in Kemp's fingers. "Let me see that," Trask muttered. Kemp, who was still looming with puff-chest authority, barely acknowledged him, but handed the card over with a grunt. "Knock yourself out." Trask looked down at the card. The name read, Malcolm Aaron Reed. He blinked. Something about it scratched at the back of his mind. Familiar. Unsettling. His thumb brushed the corner of the license. And then it hit him. Trask fumbled for his phone. Ignoring the chaos around him, he opened a browser and typed frantically. "Malcolm Reed Federal," he whispered. His fingers stumbled. He corrected the spelling. Then the result popped up, bold and undeniable. Director Malcolm A. Reed, National Intelligence Compliance Office. Appointed by Presidential Order. Overseer of Interagency Law. Enforcement Accountability. Trask's stomach flipped. His throat tightened. He looked back at Malcolm, still on the ground, his wrists locked behind him. His briefcase open. His composure unbroken. "Oh God," Trask muttered. Oh no, Kemp didn't hear him or didn't care. He was still pacing near Malcolm, barking out commands, puffed up with false confidence. "You want to talk smart, huh?" he sneered, waving the ID in the air like a prize. "Quoting rights like you're somebody. Guess what? That doesn't work when you're resisting arrest in a federal facility." Malcolm turned his head slowly and looked up. His voice was flat, controlled. "I told you once," he said, just loud enough for both officers to hear. "I'm Malcolm Reed, Director of the National Intelligence Compliance Office." Kemp paused. His sneer faltered. "You're what now?" Malcolm didn't answer. He didn't need to. Trask stepped forward, holding up his phone. "Sir, he's telling the truth," he said quickly. "He's Nico. The director. He's one of the most senior oversight officials in the country." Kemp's face slackened. His mouth opened, then closed. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Around them, several passengers gasped aloud. Reena Patel's livestream viewer count tripled in 60 seconds. Her lens had caught everything, the takedown, the ID, the file on the floor, and now this revelation. Across the country, notifications pinged into phones like wildfire. Malcolm Reed, Federal Director, cuffed at Horizon Gate. Just then, another voice cut through the thick air, calm, commanding, razor-sharp. "What in the hell is going on here?" Lieutenant Diana Morales strode toward the scene, flanked by 2 airport security officers. Her uniform was pristine. Her voice carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. She surveyed the scene with practiced efficiency, a high-level black man handcuffed on the ground, suit torn, surrounded by stunned civilians, 2 of her officers looking like they'd been caught with matches. In a burning house. "Officer Kemp." "Officer Trask," she said coolly. "Report." "Now." Trask stammered. We had a report. Suspicious individual. Black male. Formal wear. Gate B7. You thought wrong," Malcolm interrupted, his voice quiet but edged with steel. "Lieutenant Morales, my name is Malcolm Reed. I was detained without cause, physically restrained, subjected to verbal harassment and racially loaded language by your officers, despite presenting valid ID and fully complying with their commands." Morales blinked. Recognition swept across her face like a tidal wave. She looked down at the ID in Trask's hand, then at the document on the ground. Then at Malcolm. "Oh my God," she whispered. Her expression snapped back into formality. "Unlock him. Now." "Lieutenant," Kemp began, but she cut him off. "Now, officer." "That's an order." Trask stepped forward with shaking hands and retrieved the cuff key. The metal clicked open, sharp and final. Malcolm pulled his wrists forward, red and marked. He rubbed them once and said nothing. Morales stepped closer. "Director Reed," she said formally, "on behalf of this department, I extend my full apology. I will be filing a report and alerting internal affairs immediately. This will not be overlooked." Malcolm looked at her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, "It already hasn't been." He stood, adjusting his suit slowly, brushing dust from his sleeve. Around them, the sea of travelers had turned into silent witnesses. Phones were still filming. Voices murmured in disbelief. Somewhere in the background, Rena's live stream crossed 100,000 views. News alerts were firing. Headlines being typed. Within the hour, the footage had hit national platforms. Federal director handcuffed at airport without cause. Malcolm Reed profiled and detained in terminal incident. DOJ officials took notice. So did Nico's legal counsel. By the time Malcolm's plane left the tarmac that evening, rescheduled, private, and escorted, the story was already trending. The body cams from both officers were seized and placed under expedited review. And what they revealed would only deepen the fallout. But at that moment, as Malcolm sat quietly on the tarmac in a secure lounge, eyes fixed out the window at the lights lining the runway, the real weight settled in. It wasn't the bruises. It wasn't the sting of steel cuffs. It was the knowledge that none of this had happened because of a legitimate threat. It had happened because of an assumption rooted in bias, bolstered by power, and executed without hesitation. And if it could happen to him, Director Malcolm Reed, federal oversight official, educated, composed, connected, then what of those who had no title, no folder marked confidential, no journalist nearby filming their story? He leaned forward, steepling his hands. His wrists throbbed slightly. The red marks would fade. But the truth would not. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The red marks on Malcolm Reed's wrists had faded by the time the sun rose over Washington, D.C., the morning after his violent detainment at Horizon Gate. But what lingered wasn't something that could be measured in bruises or pain. It was deeper, heavier, the gnawing knowledge that without his name, without his title, he would have simply become another silent statistic. That thought followed him as headlines exploded across the nation. Every major network ran the footage. Every news crawl repeated the same chilling phrase, "Federal Oversight Director handcuffed without cause." The video captured by Rena Patel, viewed over 30 million times in 24 hours, painted an unflinching portrait of what profiling looked like in real time. And the body cams? They sealed the truth with time-stamped brutality. Within 48 hours, the Department of Justice moved swiftly. Both officers, Bradley Kemp and Logan Trask, were suspended without pay pending a formal inquiry. Their weapons and badges were confiscated. Their access to department systems revoked. It didn't stop there. DOJ officials combed through their personnel files. What they uncovered only sharpened the outrage. Kemp, the veteran officer with decades of service, had a long trail of ignored complaints. 5 excessive force allegations, 3 involving Black or Hispanic men. 2 internal warnings for racially charged language. All quietly filed away. Trask's record was clean, but the footage made clear his role, not as the aggressor, but as the silent partner who obeyed every unlawful order, failed to intervene, and helped restrain an innocent man. Days later, the U.S. Attorney's Office convened a press conference. Under the stark lights of a federal courthouse, a spokesperson read from a prepared statement. Under Title 18, U.S. Code Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law, Officer Kemp was being charged with 3 counts, unlawful detention, use of excessive force, and racially motivated misconduct. Officer Trask, though not the instigator, faced charges as an accessory to civil rights violations for failing to de-escalate or act to prevent harm. The indictment was historic in its clarity and scope. Across the country, reactions poured in. Some called it overdue justice. Others railed against it as overreach. But the law had spoken, and for once, it had spoken swiftly. When the trial date was announced, the courthouse was surrounded by barricades and camera crews. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. The prosecution wasted no time constructing their timeline. They played the body cam footage frame by frame. They paused on every racial slur, every unprovoked escalation, every second Malcolm Reed was on the floor in cuffs. Witnesses were called, travelers, airport staff, even Reena Patel, who described in chilling detail what she saw and why she started filming. The defense tried to argue that the officers were responding to a legitimate tip, that it was a case of misidentification. That stress, confusion, and a vague alert led to a misunderstanding. But the footage, the audio, and the cold, cruel words caught on tape made those defenses collapse. The courtroom shifted when Malcolm took the stand. He wore a charcoal gray suit, not unlike the one he'd worn the day of the incident. His voice was calm, measured, his tone never bitter, only resolute. "I was not handcuffed because of anything I said or did," he testified. "I was handcuffed because of what I looked like while walking to my gate." He detailed his compliance, his requests for justification, his refusal to be touched without cause. The law was used not to protect, he said, but to punish defiance of humiliation. The prosecution rested its case with his testimony still ringing in the room. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. And then, as the sun dipped low over the National Mall, the verdict came in. Guilty. On all counts. Bradley Kemp's jaw locked as the words were read. Logan Trask lowered his head and closed his eyes. The justice system they once upheld had now turned to judge them, publicly, completely. Kemp was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Trask received 18 months, suspended pending supervised probation, with mandated anti-bias and de-escalation retraining. For some, it still didn't feel like enough. But for Malcolm, the conviction was not the end, it was the beginning of something far more necessary. In the months that followed, policy reviews began across multiple airport police departments. NICO launched a nationwide audit of field-based law enforcement practices in public transportation hubs. Malcolm met with members of Congress, testified at oversight hearings, and advocated for what he called preemptive justice, reforming practices before they destroyed lives. But not all of it made headlines. Some of it lived quietly in offices and conference rooms, and training binders and reform memos. And yet, one afternoon in late October, inside a tall federal building not far from Capitol Hill, Malcolm stood by the window of his office. Outside, the city buzzed with fall energy. Inside, the air was still. His wrists had healed completely, the red indentations gone. But the memory, the moment he was forced down not as a suspect but as a symbol, remained sharp. On his desk sat a folder, crisp and white, labeled in bold, Federal Law Enforcement Anti-Bias Initiative. It was the product of months of work, testimony, collaboration with civil rights lawyers, and recommendations from oversight committees. He'd written the opening line himself, "It is not enough to respond to injustice after it occurs. We must build systems that make such injustice nearly impossible to begin with." One of his deputies entered quietly. "The task force is ready for the rollout press briefing, sir," she said. Malcolm nodded, turned from the window, and reached for the folder. "Let's make sure this isn't just another policy," he said. "Let's make it a promise." As he walked down the hallway, voices greeted him with respect. Staff paused their typing. A few nodded silently. Some had seen the footage. Others had only heard. But all of them knew one thing: the man who walked among them wasn't driven by rage. He was driven by resolve. He had taken the worst day of his public life and used it to create something lasting, for those who wouldn't have cameras rolling, who wouldn't be believed, who would simply be told to comply. That night, after the briefing, Malcolm stood outside the building, briefcase in hand, watching the sun dip behind the monuments of power and memory. The same quiet, deliberate man as before. But different. Not because of the title. Not because of the victory in court. But because of what it meant to say, firmly and without bitterness, "This happened to me." And now, it won't happen so easily to someone else. That was the legacy. Not the headline. Not the courtroom. But the prevention. And as the sky darkened above the Capitol dome, Malcolm Reed walked into the night, not as a victim, not as a hero, but as a reminder that true justice doesn't wait for power. It demands it for everyone. What happened to Malcolm Reed in that airport terminal wasn't just a story about mistaken identity, it was a story about assumptions, about power, and about how quickly dignity can be stripped away when prejudice is allowed to walk around in uniform. He was a man who had spent his entire career holding others accountable for misuse of authority. And yet, in the eyes of two officers, all that was invisible. They didn't see a title. They didn't see integrity. They only saw a black man walking alone in a suit. The lesson here is painfully clear, and justice doesn't always announce itself with a headline. It often begins quietly, with a look, a presumption, a vague report, a decision to act without cause. And when those moments go unchecked, they don't just humiliate, they harm. They erode public trust. They devalue lives. But there is also something powerful in how Malcolm responded. He didn't fight fire with fire. He didn't yell or escalate. He stood firm in who he was. He spoke clearly, demanded respect, and let the truth, and the system, speak for him. And when justice came, it didn't erase the pain, but it planted a seed for prevention. That's the legacy we should all aim for, not just seeking justice after the fact, but reshaping the systems that allow injustice to grow in the first place. So to anyone listening who's ever felt invisible, underestimated, or wrongfully judged, your experience matters. Your voice matters. And it deserves to be heard without apology or justification. Whether you wear a suit or carry a backpack, your rights are not conditional. They are yours.